Hey, Inspired Moneymaker. Today we're talking about Bitcoin, the Federal Reserve, and what is money? Episode 249 features Robert Breedlove, Freedom Maximalist, Bitcoin-focused entrepreneur.
The whole thing is a game changer, man. It is, if you consider that gold is kind of layer one, and we built all of our social institutions on top of that, first and foremost, the nation state and the central bank. Well, if Bitcoin disrupts layer one, right, it becomes the new layer one. All the relevance of every social institution we build on top of it is called into question. So that's why I think it's difficult to accept, maybe, because we're still early days, 13 years into Bitcoin. But this thing is, assuming we're at least directionally correct, we as in Bitcoin maximalists or Bitcoin proponents, that everything changes. Oh, everything changes. Socioeconomic reality, as you know it, completely changes in the wake of Bitcoin's success.
I'm Andy Wong, host of the Inspired Money podcast, where we share positive perspectives on money so we can have a bigger impact in our community and the world. This episode is brought to you by my company, Runnymede Capital Management. If you need help with financial planning, your investments, or setting up a 401k retirement plan for your business, schedule a call with me at inspiredmoney.fm/call. That's inspiredmoney.fm/CALL. We're fee-only, family-owned, and provide objective advice. Schedule a no-obligation call today. We're talking with Robert Breedlove, host of the popular What is Money show. Robert considers himself a freedom maximalist and says that he's found his life's work in the Bitcoin space as a contributor to the separation of money and state. He's inspired by Austrian economics and the teachings of Jordan Peterson. Austrian economists believe that the economy goes through natural processes, including financial crises, and that government action ultimately does more harm than good. This is in contrast to Keynesian economics that argues that markets are not always efficient and that if spending stops, the state has to fill the gap. Lowering interest rates and printing money after the 2008 financial crisis and now hiking rates today are justified in the eyes of Keynesians. The Austrian school holds that the lowering and raising of interest rates are the government's attempt to control money. Robert believes that Bitcoin is honest money and has the potential to reshape our relationship with money, free markets, and our world. In this episode, you'll learn about Robert's path from accountant to Bitcoin-focused entrepreneur, why Robert believes so strongly in Bitcoin over all other currencies, and make sure you tune in to the end to hear about government regulation, the biggest known risk to Bitcoin. Now let's get inspired with Robert Breedlove. Robert, welcome to Inspired Money. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Let's jump right in. What's your earliest childhood memory of money?
Yeah, this is a good question. I'm glad you told me what was that it was going to be the first question before we started, so I had some time to think about it. I don't have an amazing answer because it's not very early, but in fourth grade, so I guess I'm 8 years old in fourth grade, I had a teacher in elementary school named Mr. Anglin, Anglin, and he had this program in his classroom where he would basically had currency, so a little, like Monopoly money, if you will. And we'd have various contests in the classroom. One of the biggest ones was, what did we call it? Around the world. So he would hold up a multiplication table, and like one person would be going to another person's desk, and then the first person to answer, it'd be like, it's like quick draw. First person to get the answer out, you either go back to your desk or you progress on to the next. And if you could go all the way around the world, which is to go all the way, defeat every other kid in the class, basically, then you would win. That was the goal. Really rare that anyone could do that because it's, 25, 30 kids in a classroom. You got to beat 25 or 30 kids at answering the multiplication tables. And so you would get money for every right answer, but you'd get a larger sum of money for winning the whole thing, or there were different milestones you'd get different amounts of money for. You could also earn money for things like good test scores. Like if you got like a 90 plus, you got a bonus. Proper behavior, not talking in the hall, not getting tickets, not being what did they give? What did they used to give out? There were hall monitors. If you're talking in the hallway, they'd like write you a ticket, and so that would be a deduction. And you could get what else did we do? Anyways, so he's basically implementing this incentive system for good school-age kid behavior, right? Using currency, but and then the currency could be used to buy prizes. Like once every month or a couple of months, you'd have this little auction, and you'd go on auction, spend the money to get little toys and prizes and all that. But in the morning before class every day, he hand selected 4 kids, I think, to be the bankers. So the bankers would come in when most of the kids would be in breakfast in the cafeteria. The chosen bankers would come into the classroom and like do the accounting essentially. And so I was selected for that job, and I did it for a little while, but I eventually quit because I wanted to be in breakfast with the kids, cutting up. So I guess that is the earliest memory of money that comes to me. When you ask the question, I'm sure there's an earlier one, but I can't think of it. So I'll leave it at that.
Your teacher sounds like a real capitalist.
Yeah. And man, what a great way to learn, honestly, because kids would get really competitive at the multiplication game, right? They would study, they would train, it would, the test scores, like he was one of the best teachers. He was there for a long, long time. I want to say he taught at that school for like I don't know if his whole career, but he was there for 25, 30 years, to the point where parents that had learned under him also had kids that went to him. And he was just a really celebrated teacher. And
what was his name?
I'm happy. Mr. Anglin.
Well, you spelled it for me.
Yeah, Anglin. And yeah, he was a really good guy, really celebrated teacher. And I learned a lot through that process it definitely activates your competitive energies once you put some money at stake, right? Even if the money is not money technically, it was just, tickets for prizes. The kids got really serious about the competitions that involve the money.
Do you think that Mr. England's class influenced you to go on to study accounting?
It's possible. My father was an accountant too. So I guess that was somewhat of perhaps a biological or natural influence on me. Going into college, or I guess say leaving high school, going into college, I had this conception of my future that I wanted to be a businessman. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I just had this like loose visualization of a guy that, carries a briefcase and sends faxes and cashes checks, maybe something like that. But then when I actually got into college, you don't have to declare a major until your junior year. So your first 2 years, you're taking a lot of prerequisite courses. I decided I wanted to go to business school. So that was a decision I had to make by freshman, sophomore year. And then when I got into business school, I didn't know what I wanted to study. And when I looked at the field of options, I just inquired about what the most challenging one was. And I was going to the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And University of Tennessee, Knoxville had what they called the MAC program, MACC, which is the Masters of Accountancy program, that I think at the time was like ranked number 12 in the country. So for a public university, this was a relatively highly ranked program. And when I asked people about it, I was like, well, what's the hardest thing to do in business school? And they're like, oh, for sure, accounting. Accounting is the hardest thing. I've always kind of ran towards challenge. So I was like, all right, I'll do that one. And so decided to do accounting. And then when I completed the undergraduate, I decided to go on and pursue the master's degree as well. And then I encountered another choice there, as you can choose either audit or tax as your concentration. And sort of the same thing. I didn't know what I wanted to choose. It was actually a combination of factors. One was, which one was harder? Everyone said tax was harder, so I was kind of naturally leaning that way. And then the other factor was when the audit professor came into the room before people actually chose their concentration, and he started to talk. He was a very, very elderly gentleman, very monotone. And I was just like, I'm just going to go with tax because this seems like might be kind of a sleepy situation, spending a couple of semesters with this guy. So I don't know. I've never connected the dots in my own path if Mr. Anglin was an influence on my later choice for college education, but I'm just very grateful to have gone through that experience because it was, first of all, I got really good at multiplication. And I guess you just got to see a side of reality that maybe most kids don't get to see until much later in life. So if anything, if my deeper self would say that he inspired me to be more entrepreneurial, at least.
Interesting. Yeah, the way you describe it just sounds like a fun way of learning, getting competitive, encouraging people to learn their multiplication facts and to act faster. That all sounds great. I'm curious that since you did study accounting, and I've heard you talk about, doing tax strategies for high net worth, doing CFO work for tech companies. Since you mentioned entrepreneurship, what is it about a more linear career that caused you to change and take a leap to do something different?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head. When I first came out of the master's program, I went straight into public accounting. I had actually done when did I do the internship? I think I did an internship with an accounting firm prior to the master's program, the summer before. And then after the master's program, went straight into work for an accounting firm. It was a larger regional firm based in Nashville, Tennessee. So there were, I think at the time, between 1,000 and 1,500 employees. And they offered the whole gamut of services you get from the big four. So, audit, tax, consulting. Tech was a big piece too. They're helping companies implement different operational technologies. That experience was really good in a way, having gone through a couple of tax seasons. I guess 4 tax seasons in total, but also extremely painful. For those that don't know about the accounting profession, tax professionals in particular, in the run up to tax season for it varies, but say 3 to 6 months prior to the big tax deadline, right, is mid-April. But then there's also extended tax deadlines in October and different dates. So depending on which area you're focused on, you would go into a busy season, as they called it. And the partners in the accounting firm would email everyone once a week in the tax division and say, hey, this is kind of the target hours we're looking for this week. And it's all about billable hours, very much like the legal profession. And that was, you're basically being a human computer, I guess. So it's one thing to say, hey, I'm an entrepreneur, I work 80 hours a week. Okay, I've done that too. That's a whole totally different experience than sitting inside of a cubicle, crunching numbers. It's not so much crunching numbers. You're resolving complicated issues, right? They may have structured a certain group of entities in a way to try and mitigate tax exposure, and you're evaluating that structure against what's allowable by the law, and you're suggesting changes to ultimately save them in tax liability. So, but the actual, it's almost inhumane, I guess, because you're just sitting there like dealing with big, ugly, complicated problems for multiple hours per week. The structure is that there's basically staff, senior staff, manager, senior manager, partner. And so all of the monotonous work that can roll downhill does roll downhill. And then that work is reviewed by managers and reviewed by partners to kind of train people up the hierarchy, so to speak. So the linearity for me was seeing my whole career path every day. I'd walk in, I would see the partners, I would see the managers, I would see, they're working their ass off too. They're there, even though partners make really good money in most accounting firms, they're still there 60, 80 hours a week for months on end during busy season. And what was very common amongst everyone is just this sort of, what's the right word? Self-loathing might be too strong, but everyone's just like, oh man, this sucks. Like working this much for this long is really taking its toll. And indeed, it did take its toll on people. Like it's not, I don't think humans are evolved to do that type of work for that extensive of a duration, let's say. And I don't know, I guess the entrepreneurial spirit inside of me did not like the predictability and linearity of that. It's like, just keep doing this motion every year. You lean into the tax season and work a lot. And then there was a balance to it that you would get a lot of time off when things aren't busy. So you could you could have a lot of time off, but you do that and you repeat that process year over year and you get to the top as a partner, and then you make whatever 7 figures a year for life, and that's it, right? That's the whole thing. And that just, I don't know, it scared the shit out of me. I was like, this can't be it. Like, I'm not going to just sit under here under fluorescent lights and be a human computer for the next 50 years and then retire. And I guess further to that was, I had a lot of great colleagues, a lot of really smart people. I learned a lot. I'm like forever grateful for that. However, as you might imagine, the social dynamics in an accounting firm leave a bit to be desired. So, you would go to lunch together and trying to, like, I don't know, have some humor, a little bit of levity, and it just, people can be a bit dry. Obviously, I'm generalizing, but that was my experience of it. So I just decided that I needed something less linear, something more, I guess the other aspect of this is I have more of a risk appetite as a young man. And so I needed something that was less safe, more, higher risk, higher reward sort of thing. So that's when I decided to jump into the entrepreneurial world. And yeah, I was basically a finance chief for a few different early and mid-stage companies, mostly focused in tech. And that was much more aligned with me and my skill set. I should back up a little bit and say that I grew up playing video games. I've told this story before. I don't know if you've heard it, but there was this massive online multiplayer game called Diablo II that I was playing from the age of like 11 to maybe like 10 to 14, somewhere in that range. And this game was wildly popular worldwide. Millions of people played it. It was effectively like Dungeons and Dragons, but you're playing online with other people. But the interesting thing about this game is that you're trawling these dungeons, fighting demons and all these things, but you're looking for new items to equip your character and level them up and make them stronger and better and all of that. So there's a high degree of customizability in the game. The items themselves could be traded with other players. So there was the game, you could be like actually in the game in the dungeons, or you could exit the game and go into the trade channels. And this was super interesting. There were all these different channels around the world, right? You could go trade with people in North America or Asia. You could just jump around. And I gradually started to transition away from playing the game in the dungeons and more towards trading as just kind of the full-time thing I was doing. So I I would try to buy items low and sell items high and accumulate wealth. Another interesting thing happened there too is there was no currency in the game. It was all barter. So you would trade, like 2 helmets for a shield or whatever it was. But a currency naturally emerged inside of the game. People use these little rings called the Stone of Jordan ring, became the currency. So when you're advertising things to trade in the trade channel, you would price it. Like, I have this Wind Force Hydra bow available for 30 SOJs, Stone of Jordan rings. So I didn't know this at the time. Obviously, it's just interesting that, this currency sort of naturally emerged where the game designers did not intend there to be one. And then I also just learned, again, economics 101, right? Buy low, sell high. And I also learned to type really fast because you're trading with people, you're not talking to them. This was all done by keyboard. So I was, typing 90 words a minute by the time I was, 12, 13 years old. So I think I like to joke that I was in digital assets, 15 years before Bitcoin. I was buying and selling these digital assets in this game. And this all sounds a little bit hokey, perhaps, but the last piece to that is interesting that eBay started to become popular around that time as well. And eventually people started to sell these items on eBay for real money. So these bows that were 30 SOJs or whatever it was now selling for quite a bit of money at the time. It was like hundreds to thousands of dollars. And that definitely left a mark on me. I've had this thesis for a long time now, since then, largely, that I thought the world would become a video game. Like, more and more, I saw the power of being able to mediate commercial relationships through technology in this way that wasn't being done to a large extent in the world at the time. And I just had this intuition, I don't know if it's a theory, more of an intuition, that more of real world interactions would start to be mediated by screens and technologies. So I guess I had this intuition about the digital age, and with that intuition, I had this deep desire to try to align my professional life to that, right? Wherever the convergence of technology and finance and I guess digital tech sort of aligned, that's what I was trying to put my career on a similar path. So yeah, I think it's played out pretty true. I think it's really funny now that we're all talking about the metaverse. Well, not we're all, some people are talking about it, and it does seem like the world's becoming more like a video game. People date through these dating apps now. We shop through online shopping. We're doing peer-to-peer media right now through a screen. I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time with this little inorganic partner of mine that I call a laptop. And I engage with a lot of people through it, but I'm not physically in their presence. So what else do you call that other than a fucking video game? So, anyways, I may have veered off from the original question, but I hope that was insightful for where I'm coming from.
No, that's a very powerful foreshadowing of alternative currencies and the metaverse. And you didn't even know what would transpire years ahead. So clearly you had this drive of your philosophy of money prior to Bitcoin. How has your definition of money evolved over your life year to date?
Well, I grew up with, early on, we were wealthy, my family was, and then we had some harder times kind of in my early mid childhood going into teenage years. We're a little more humble, let's say, financially.
What happened?
So, my mother and father separated, and my father was very successful. And my mother was successful in her own right, but it was definitely a different lifestyle when they separated. And, so I guess I had a changing relationship with money through that process. But when I actually got into the thinking about money, I would say one of the things I started to do in my late teenage years, and it was a habit that I persisted in throughout college and into my young adult life, was reading The Economist magazine. And it's a great magazine, was a great magazine. I don't know. I don't read it anymore. They have a lot of different sections in there. So, you can learn about science and art, technology, culture, obviously economics. The one thing I would say about that now in retrospect is the economics in The Economist magazine is bunk. It's Keynesian stuff, Keynesian bullshit. Excuse my French. So, but really well written. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot about, I would, annotate the magazines and I would write. And so I learned a lot about reading and writing at a higher level, I guess, by engaging with that magazine. But it deepened my curiosity about, and the reason I started reading the magazine is because I was just trying to unravel the mystery of what is this big machine we all inhabit, the global economy. What does that mean? I didn't know anything. I didn't know what a stock was. I was like, what? When people talk about the stock market, I couldn't get my head around it. Like, you're trading pieces of paper that represent interest in companies, or like how, I just didn't understand anything. So that was my draw into The Economist magazine. The writing and wide variety of topics is what really held my interest. But eventually there was something lacking, right? I still didn't understand economics. I still didn't understand money. And I think it was a girl I was dating at the time. Her stepfather was getting this economics newsletter once a week. And the guy was a super libertarian, so he's beating up on the Federal Reserve all the time, talking about how corrupt money is. So that I was like, oh, okay, this resonates with me. There's something I couldn't detect in The Economist magazine, but this guy seems to be speaking to it. So I started going down that rabbit hole and eventually found The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is basically describes the inception of the Federal Reserve and makes the very compelling case that central banking is the black heart of the modern global economy. All right, it's a corrupt institution to the core, a global currency counterfeiting operation. There's a lot of, you've probably heard me describe this in a lot of my work. So I came to this realization that, wow, our money is like super fucked, and it's a very corrupt institution, and it runs the world. But at that time, I also experienced this feeling of powerlessness to change it, because there was nothing you could really do. Again, I guess this is probably 5 to 7 years before Bitcoin. So, 2004, 2005. And I don't know, that just left a mark on me. I felt like I had found the bottom of that rabbit hole. Like, oh, it's the money is really broken, but there's nothing we can really do about it. Like, you can educate people, but that's not enough to actually change the system. So it was kind of like a bitter discovery for me. And I just put it away, put it in a box, and moved on with my life. Like, went on into my career, the accounting and CFO stuff I told you about. So I'm sorry, the original question was, how has my relationship with money changed over time?
Yeah, how has your definition of...
Definition, okay.
Is that what I said? Yeah, I think definition of money, how has it evolved over your life?
Yeah, fair enough. So at that point, after having discovered central banking and the nature of money under the legal monopoly of central banking, my definition of money was, it's a scam, basically. It's corrupt, it's a scam, it's a pyramid scheme. It's really bad, basically. Fast forward to 2016, 2017, I was basically leaving a position as a CFO of a tech company to start my own company. I didn't know what I was going to do. I had one consulting client at the time, just doing some CFO consulting for them. But in retrospect, that move got me out of in the CFO position. I was very impoverished of time. I had no time, right? I was working all the time for the company, essentially. But when I made that lateral move to start my own business, I had all this free time. So I started going down rabbit holes and learning as much as I could. And ironically enough, when I found the concept of smart contracts, which was being marketed by Ethereum, and then I was like, okay, what's a smart contract? I'm going down that rabbit hole. I get to Nick Szabo's work. He uses the example of the vending machine as the most primitive smart contract. It's a layer that intermediates between buyers and sellers,
removing a middleman.
Yeah. So in the case of a vending machine, right, it's if buyer inserts 50 cents and presses B38, then release item in B38, something like that, right? So it's automating. There's a seller has encoded their wishes into that machine. Here's the product selection, here's the pricing. The buyer comes to the vending machine with the money and the code, and that transaction is automated basically through the vending machine versus a guy sitting in a kiosk somewhere selling you Cokes and candy bars or whatever. So I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And then, in that, I would encourage everyone to read this. I actually forget the title, but it's got smart contracts in it. It's by Nick Szabo. It's written in the mid 90s. His blog is called the Unenumerated Blog, I think. He goes on to extrapolate that out into global finance. It's like, well, the whole finance industry, actually, it's a non-productive sector in that it's not building any, equipment or machinery or anything that's actually creating economic yield. But what it is doing is efficiently connecting buyers and sellers or lenders and borrowers of capital in a way that, accelerates the process of free trade. And so my light bulb moment was like, oh, wow. The whole finance industry is a giant smart contract or a complex of smart contracts, if you will. We're currently using human beings to intermediate a lot of this. At least what I'm reading over here in Ethereum and crypto world is saying, no, we can do a lot of this with software that we're currently doing with human labor. So my epiphany was like, oh, wow, I think what the Industrial Revolution did to physical labor, this crypto asset revolution could do to cognitive labor, at least in the sphere of finance to a large extent. And so that was like light bulb moment for me. Like I said, I just started this business. I bought initially just the crypto assets that were available on Coinbase on the mobile app, which were Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin. Didn't really know what I was doing, just bought them. And then like when I tell this tale, I always like to say, where my money went, my mind followed. And that sort of speaks to this other definition of money I have today, which I think is actually an extension of the human mind. It's a way we scale the logos or human reason or rationality. It's a perceptual tool, right? To see the price of something change, I don't need to know any of the fact patterns behind that cause the price change. The number alone tells me and incentivizes me to buy less of it. If it goes up, buy less, produce more, or use substitutes. So there's this, we're interconnecting our minds through the pricing system. And money is the mediating third that allows that to take place. So I invested in the space in crypto. Where my money went, my mind followed. And the more I started to study, the more I became narrowly focused on Bitcoin, right? Everything else was decentralized in name only. Bitcoin was the only thing that seemed to be actually decentralized and was competing to be a non-state money. And again, with my background views on central banking, that was the most important thing in the world, right? If you could figure out a way to disrupt or inhibit the central bank somehow, that would be globally beneficial, let's say. But it wasn't until, so I was becoming more and more, by April 2017, I had launched a multi-strategy crypto asset fund. We're multi-strategy, multi-coin. By November of, that's 17. By November of 17, we launched our second fund. I'm writing these monthly updates to my LPs. I'm becoming more, you can see if you watch the progress of the updates, it's like my focus is narrowing to Bitcoin over time. And then finally in April 2018, I was lucky enough to get the Bitcoin Standard like right when it came out, like the week it came out, and I read it immediately. Over a weekend, I think I just read the whole thing. And so that was the real aha. That was like, oh, this Bitcoin is the answer to the central banking conundrum that I identified at this point 13 years ago at the time. And so there was like this gap in my thinking, which was Austrian economics, which Safdien was so kind to write about so eloquently in his book, The Bitcoin Standard. And that just was the last puzzle piece for me to really come to see Bitcoin as the solution to the biggest problem in the world, which is central banking.
Do you still have your fund? I noticed that your description often says former hedge fund manager.
Yeah, so I'll get to that in just a moment. So April 18, I read The Bitcoin Standard. By November 2018, I was 33 years old at the time. I got my first tattoo, my only tattoo, which is a Bitcoin tattoo here under my right arm. And it represents skin in the game to me, that I think Bitcoin's all about skin in the game. It's restoring skin in the game to the world, right? And another way to say that is unifying actors with the consequences of their actions, which is the opposite of the central bank, right? Actors inside of the central bank choose to print money. They externalize all the consequences onto other people, and they keep the benefits for themselves. So it's a lack of skin in the game that makes central banking so inherently ineffective and evil, in my estimation. And so I go on operating the funds from April 17, and then my most recent epiphany was post-COVID. The benchmark in our fund was Bitcoin, buy and hold Bitcoin. Like, how do you generate alpha in Bitcoin terms, or said differently, how do you outperform Bitcoin? Net of fees, by the way. So if you're a 20% performance fee, it's not good enough to outperform Bitcoin by 10 or 15%. You need to clear the hurdle, so to speak. So my realization there was, wow, I've been spending all my blood, sweat, and tears trying to outperform the best performing asset in human history. And it takes all my time, absorbs all, markets are 24/7, they never stop. It was stressful, mixed success. Sometimes some quarters you outperform, some quarters you underperform. And my realization was like, what am I doing? I could just buy and hold, just be the benchmark. And then I would completely liberate myself to do whatever I want to do. And increasingly what I wanted to do was more writing and more talking and more thinking, more reading about Bitcoin and all the topics that it touches, which is an unbelievably vast array of topics when you really get into the rabbit hole. And so by November 2020, that's exactly what I did. I got out of the fund business entirely and decided to launch the What is Money show. Initially, I thought this would just be a hobby / passion niche project. But by, I guess somewhat serendipitously, when I was thinking about making this transition, so leading up to November 2020, I get a Twitter DM on, I think this is August 2020, from this guy named Michael Saylor. I'd never heard of him before. And he's like, hey, here's the article. We just announced our first buy of, I think it was $500 million in Bitcoin. Thanks for your work. We think it's brilliant. And I was like, that's interesting. All this stuff I've been writing, and a guy just sends you it's not every day you get a DM, a guy saying he bought $500 million in Bitcoin. Thanks for your work. And so I'm like, that's strange. And then at this time when I was formulating what the show would be like, the title, what am I going to do? I was thinking about who would be the ideal first guest, and he just landed in my lap. I was like, oh. So I invited Mr. Saylor to come on. The Saylor series was an unbelievable success of a podcast. I still get people DMing me about it all the time. I take little to no credit for it. Mr. Saylor is the greatest ambassador we have for Bitcoin. The guy can practically interview himself, but I'm very fortunate to have, I guess, asked him the question, what is money, that unfurled the subsequent 25 hours of 5-star content that he provided. So that's it. I guess somewhat inspired by my interactions with him, because Mr. Saylor is very passionate about education. He is the chairman of the Saylor Academy, which gives free university level education to people worldwide. And also, like I said earlier, just wanting to lean in to the Bitcoin rabbit hole more, learn more, and also taking feedback from the market. The job I was doing as a fund manager is very much behind the screen all the time, playing a whole different kind of video game. People that had read my work and seen my podcast were saying more, like write more, talk more, write more, talk more. And so that combination with this inspiration towards education and really just getting me back to what I love to do, which is I like to read, and I'm learning to like to write. Writing is still very painful, doing my best. I do love to read though. And I didn't know that I had a gift for talking until I started doing all this. So that's where I'm at now. I feel extremely fortunate that I've unified my passion and my profession to a large extent. I would be doing this if money were no object. But I get to do it and get paid, and I get to create value in the lives of others while at the same time capturing some of that value for my family. So I've had a lot of, bumps along the way in life, as I'm sure most of us have, but I feel extremely grateful that I have at least, I think, figured this out for myself. I think I've found my life's work, and eternally grateful for that.
Yeah, how does that feel, finding your life's work?
Damn good. You never work a day in your life, as they say.
I don't know if you ever read the Bloomberg article about Michael Saylor. It was written after the internet bubble burst, but it was one of my favorite articles because it talked about his journey leading Microstrategy, which was a profitable software company. And, around must have been in 1999, roughly, suddenly, like, all the internet web search engines and all the internet companies were going public. And the more money they were losing, the higher their stock was going up. And Michael was like, what's going on? I have a profitable software company. How come my stock is like at 60 cents or something? He was very frustrated. And the article talked about how he changed the business model so that he could start making acquisitions and get into more of an internet narrative saying, we're getting eyeballs. It's not about profit. And then his stock, I don't know how high it went. It went to like $400. And on paper, he was one of the richest men in America briefly. And then of course, we know what happened with the internet bubble. All the companies crashed, and he went like full circle on paper. Like, he went from nothing, he went to like wealthiest man to nothing again. And then the irony was all the lawyers descended upon him with class action lawsuits. And he was saying, I'm like the biggest shareholder. Why are you suing me? I'm a victim too. But anyways, it was a great article. And I thought it just it encapsulated like the craziness of the internet days. And for him to sort of be front and center during crypto, if you parallel crypto and the internet took 15 years, I would say, to really mature into businesses that were profitable and sustainable. In the early days, it was Wild West and there was speculation. Do you think that's a fair comparison to crypto today?
Yeah, there's definitely, and you could read about this in the book. The name escapes me now, but it's basically the S curve of adoption, right? There tends to be this realization like, oh, this new technology is going to change the world. And then a lot of capital rushes into these visions, like in the internet, anything with a .com, right? Pets.com, you put a .com on anything, just like today, people put a blockchain on anything, and that somehow pumps stock value. The expectations way outrun the reality, so you get these huge speculative fervors in asset classes related to the emergent tech. And then inevitably there's some reconciliation, right? There's some typically kind of a bubble and then a burst, a return to reality, a depression of those values really into the realm of disillusionment. And that's when you want to go and buy. And then that's also when entrepreneurs tend to build a lot, right? The tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked, insolvent companies get washed away, those that are responsible and operationally disciplined build, succeed, and then go on to actually become the FANG stocks, for instance.
Yes.
And that's a pattern, right? That's a pattern of technological innovation. And one that I would say here too, if you haven't read Mr. Saylor's book, The Mobile Wave, he wrote that in 2010. He's basically saying, go out and buy Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and hold it for the next 10 years. And he's given a very sophisticated thesis behind that he thought, the digital age was going to be on par with the transformation from agricultural to industrial or some other change of epoch. And he was right? He was spot on. That's if you were going to buy anything in 2010 and hold it to today, that's what you wanted to buy, were those stocks. So he has a deep understanding of the technology space overall. He also has a deep historical understanding in terms of how that maps onto where we are today with crypto. I guess it's somewhat different in that the .com mania was all about companies, right? These are all equities. These are businesses. And there's also this, conventional wisdom, if you will, on Wall Street or traditional investing in general, that diversify. You always want to hold a little bit of everything because you don't know which one's going to hit. None of that really applies to crypto in my estimation, because Bitcoin, it's not a company. It's something we really struggle to describe, honestly, because it's not like anything we've ever seen before. You could call it a decentralized company or a decentralized organization. You could call it an internet protocol, right? Something more like HTTP or TCP/IP rather than any of the internet companies built on top of those protocols. You could call it the disruption of gold, right? A digital disruption to the analog technology that is gold. And I think that whole diversification, conventional wisdom doesn't apply at all in crypto. I think a lot of people get burned thinking that, just like I thought when I first came over. I was like, I don't know, I'm just going to buy the ones the market says are the best right now, which are the top 3 by market cap. But, again, if you do the diligence and you do the homework, you spend your minimum 100 hours studying Bitcoin, crypto, I think to even get to the basic level of understanding, I really think 100 hours is kind of a minimum investment.
You go down a lot of rabbit holes.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of time. It sounds ridiculous. Why would it take 100 hours to study one thing to start to get it? But when you start to peel back the layers and you realize how interdisciplinary it is, right? You need to get a little bit of computer science, a little bit of economics, not Keynesian economics, Austrian economics. You need network effects. You need cryptography. You need monetary evolution. You need economic history. You need government intervention. There's psychology, sociology. There's all these different domains that sort of meet at a nexus point in Bitcoin. So you've got to put in 100 hours to even start to understand the the diversity of things you need to understand Bitcoin, if that makes sense. So to try to answer your question, I guess where it doesn't parallel .com is that I think this movement is all about Bitcoin. I think that's it. I think Bitcoin may be the only thing we see at layer one in this wave of innovation. Now, that doesn't, a cursory glance at that would sound really bad. You're like, oh, what do you mean? That's not innovation. That's just one simple thing that, creates a new block every 10 minutes and has 21 million. That's not even innovative. But it's when you start considering what you can build on top of Bitcoin with this immutable global consensus, right? This single source of truth that can't be argued with in any way. That's why I think you get a lot of that crypto theory. It's a forum in which it can actually be realized. So a lot of these things, like smart contracts, for instance, I don't think smart contracts are going to work at scale on Ethereum or any Ethereum competitor. I think they will be built on layer 2 and above on Bitcoin in a way that actually works, because it needs the anchor point into global immutable consensus. So I would say all that to say that your conventional wisdom, the conventional wisdom, not yours in particular, the conventional wisdom about diversification is not going to map intelligently onto this crypto wave of innovation. And in fact, I would throw out the term crypto and say it's Bitcoin. And, who knows? Time will tell. I would say too that, there's a very distinct moral and humanitarian aspect to this as well that I think lends Bitcoin almost the followers of Bitcoin, the adherents to Bitcoin, Bitcoin maximalists, whatever you want to call them. It creates an almost religious-like fervor in that, again, if you understand the depths of the pain and inefficiency and self-destructive nature of central banking. And if Bitcoin is our one shot to get this monkey off our back, we've been dealing with this institution for a long time now. World War I and World War II would not have been possible to the extent that they were if it were not for central banking. And if you haven't studied World War I or World War II, that alone should be enough to tell you how important Bitcoin is, right? If we can just reduce the scale and scope of warfare. Go ahead.
I know that you've written a lot about the central bank. You've written a lot about inflation as theft. And this is the first time in my career that I'm living in a world where we have inflation at levels that we're seeing. In the past, the central bank would always lower interest rates in the face of a potential recession, in hopes of making the recession shallower, in hopes of supporting the financial markets. This is the first time that it's different.
Ostensibly.
Right? Yeah. Do you think that this time is different? And you talk about Keynesian economics versus Austrian economics. Is there a potential for this experiment that the central bank has been practicing, that if it doesn't work, there could be a change?
Well, to answer the question is this time different? I guess would depend on what you thought last time was like. Now, if we're taking the narrow focus on recent U.S. experience, then yeah, this time is going to be different because I think we're going to go through currency collapse. That hasn't happened to the U.S. dollar historically. So yeah, this time would be different. But if you take a broader view of central banking, starting with the Bank of Antwerp, getting into the Bank of England, going through all the different implementations we've seen across the world, they all end the same way. They all debase the currency until it's meaningless, and the civilization running the currency basically implodes. And this goes even prior to central banking. You go back to coin clipping in ancient Rome, same thing. Debase the money, debauch its informational utility, right? It's not, prices don't mean anything. The more you inflate or debase the currency, the less prices mean. The more capital gets misallocated, the more we self-destruct as a civilization, right? You're literally shrinking the scope of cooperation as you debase the currency. So in that sense, no, I don't think things are different at all. I think we're just going to see it at a much larger scale this time, given that all central banks worldwide are engaging in currency debasement in a coordinated fashion. So as a punchline to that, I'll just say that without Bitcoin, I would be extremely pessimistic for the next few decades. And I still think things could get much darker before the dawn, so to speak. But thankfully, we have something like Bitcoin that allows us to opt out of this pyramid scheme we call fiat currency.
I know that you're such a strong believer in Bitcoin because in the 13 years, we've learned that there's a supply cap. It hasn't been able to have been violated. What are the risks? Like, what are your thoughts on regulation? Because that's such a it's such a relevant topic today. We're seeing SEC writings about Bitcoin. I think there's a lot of worry about what our government's going to do. What will the U.S. government do? What will other countries say about Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's definitely the greatest known unknown about Bitcoin in terms of risk. You know, you could say an unknown unknown is a black swan. That would, in my opinion, that would be the greatest threat to Bitcoin. And by definition, I can't even talk about it because you don't see a black swan coming. That's what a black swan is. But in terms of known unknowns, the state response to Bitcoin or regulation is the greatest threat. However, the thing about regulation is that when you apply it to Bitcoin, Bitcoin is ultimately just information. It is just speech. It is just code, right? So to try and make speech or code illegal doesn't work. We have U.S. Circuit Court precedent for this. You could study the case of PGP, which is pretty good privacy software. The courts were trying to classify it as munitions when it was being exported from the United States. The defendants of PGP basically said they printed out the source code, presented it as evidence, and once it was seen that it's just text, right? It's just information on paper. It was immediately protected under the First Amendment in the United States. So now you could go on and say, oh, well, maybe they'll just overturn the First Amendment. Maybe they will. But you still can't regulate an idea. It'd be like trying to outlaw English. Right? If people find it useful, it's a psychotechnology. It's informational. It's insubstantive. This is non-corporeal. You can't put it in a box or put it in a cage or stop people from using it. The same is true for Bitcoin. It's open source software. The cat is out of the bag. And there's a great quote that, there's nothing more unstoppable than an idea whose time has come. And I would argue that in a world drowning in a flood of fake currency, that the idea of money that nobody can print is the idea whose time has come here early in the 21st century. So I don't see how you can viably stop Bitcoin with regulation. And I would add too that it seems to me that the current strategy is regulatory ambiguity. So the SEC is not establishing a clear position, nor any of these other bodies. They're all just kind of hand wavy, dragging their feet, not giving clear rules. And my intuition is that the regulatory ambiguity is intended to keep large capital pools on the sidelines, right? That's why they're not approving an ETF. Everyone in the world, not everyone in the world, it's increasingly easy to understand the value proposition of Bitcoin. As I just said, money that nobody can print in a world where everybody's printing money. But what will keep large capital, big money on the sidelines is regulatory risk, because the guys internally making those decisions, it's all about career risk, right? They don't want to be the first mover. They want clear rules. They don't want to jeopardize their job and their pension and their reputation taking some risky investment if there's not a clear legal and regulatory framework around it. So that's how I see things currently, but ultimately the idea of Bitcoin, it's, people have used the analogy of the mind virus. I wrote a piece called The Number Zero in Bitcoin. Once the number zero was discovered, there were a lot of people, including the medieval church was the dominant institution of the day, that did not like the number zero. It undermined their entire philosophy of why they were the dominant institution of the world. Zero was antithetical to that, but they couldn't stop it. You couldn't do anything about it because it's just an idea. So I'm not worried about regulation. I don't think regulation can stop Bitcoin. I think it can delay it. It can delay large money moving into it. But as surely as central banks will continue to print money to implicitly default on government debt, I'm of equal certainty that Bitcoin will succeed, because essentially Bitcoin is that. It's an insurance policy on central banking. The more dollars the Fed prints, the more valuable Bitcoin will become.
Well, it's very interesting, especially since you say maybe the cat's already out of the bag. And we see that the big banks that were deemed too big to fail by the US government, big banks are interested in possibly purchasing crypto exchanges. We see payment companies like PayPal, like Square, Jack Dorsey. The involvement is such that maybe we're already past the point of the government coming in and saying, you're not allowed to use this.
Yeah. If you understand how the global financial system works, and you understand why there's a legal monopoly on money, you understand why that inflation, which is the same thing as counterfeiting, is allowable for those inside the aegis of the central bank legal monopoly and disallowed for those outside, then you'll quickly understand that Bitcoin is effectively the ultimate enemy of the state, right? It's liberation for people. That you don't have to be in this pyramid scheme anymore where you're being scammed all the time. And you can't put the dollars under your mattress, right? Because they can still print more of them. There was no escape before Bitcoin. You had physical gold, you could bury it in your backyard, but good luck doing anything with that. Like, you're going to bury a bunch of gold in your backyard. How are you going to transact? What?
You better stay home. You can't go anywhere.
Yeah, it's not globally transactable. You never had a non-state, globally transactable form of a property right, let's say, independent of the state, that's not even acknowledged by the state, like a bearer asset is, physical possession of gold. You never had a version of that was globally transactable 24/7 and very resistant to confiscation, because again, it's just information. You can store it in a million different ways. The whole thing is a game changer, man. It is, if you consider that gold is kind of layer one, and we built all of our social institutions on top of that, first and foremost, the nation state and the central bank. Well, if Bitcoin disrupts layer one, right, it becomes the new layer one. All the relevance of every social institution we build on top of it is called into question. So that's why I think it's difficult to accept, maybe, because we're still early days, 13 years into Bitcoin. But this thing is, assuming we're at least directionally correct, we as in Bitcoin maximalists or Bitcoin proponents, that everything changes. Everything changes. Socioeconomic realities, it completely changes in the wake of Bitcoin's success.
Robert, I like to ask all the Inspired Money guests, how do you define success?
Success. I do my best to orient my life to freedom, truth, and love. I think they're all intimately connected with one another. And I guess success for me would be becoming the best version of myself. And it's not purely financial, although financial is a component of that. It's also engaging, what did Socrates say? Socrates said, an unexamined life is not worth living. So to be constantly engaged in this process of self-examination, self-actualization, self-improvement, across all dimensions of your life, and then hopefully leading a life as a result that is exemplary of goodness, right? Or of freedom and truth and love to others. I think that is success for me, just to create this movement towards a better tomorrow. We don't have time to go into it today, but the corruption of money does not have only financial consequences. I think it's, you go to the website, WTFhappened1971.com, you'll see a whole gamut of data that shows how screwy things have become over the past 50 years. And it's not just financial. It's health, it's addiction, it's relationships, it's everything. I think when you debase the money, you debase human morality. And so I hope to just, what did you say before the show? That we're lucky enough to be born in interesting times. I hope to be taking my life in a direction that inspires others to move in a similar direction for themselves. That would be success for me.
Freedom, truth, and love. Well, thank you, Robert, for sharing your experiences and your thoughts with us. I think you're always encouraging a lot of people to think more and to go down their own rabbit holes. Tell the Inspired Money listeners and viewers where they should follow you and get more. And you've got to check out, if you don't already, What is Money? You've got to subscribe.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you, as I said earlier, about always retweeting our shows. I really appreciate that. Yeah, you could find me on Twitter at Breedlove22. That's my last name. So it's at BREEDLOVE22. There is a link to my link tree there that has links to all the show links, YouTube, podcasts, etc. You could also check out my writing on Substack. It's called The Freedom Analects. There's links to that in the Twitter profile as well. And thank you for having me, and thank you for being a participant in this educational movement. Hopefully we're helping wake people up.
So what was your favorite Inspired Money moment? I'm impressed with the intensity of Robert's explorations down the proverbial Bitcoin rabbit hole. He does his research and lives in alignment with his convictions. Can the action of debasing a currency also translate into debasing human morality? Robert thinks so. Seeing how money can potentially corrupt people through greed, it's very interesting to look at money and government through a lens of morality. Let's ponder that for a while. If you had a different favorite Inspired Money moment, please post a comment or share it in the Inspired Moneymakers Facebook group at inspiredmoney.fm/Facebook. Thank you for tuning in to the end. Be sure to subscribe to my email that goes out every 2 weeks. It's investment focused, and the Runnymede investment team highlights data, news, and events that we think are worth sharing. Subscribe at inspiredmoney.fm/newsletter. Thank you for joining me on this mission. Have an inspired week and do something that scares you, because that's where the magic happens.